Hello. Today I would like to walk you through how I like to set up my Django project environment in PyCharm and how its interactive debugger helps me during the development lifecycle. If you do not yet have PyCharm installed, head over to their website to download the free community edition. The first thing we need to do is get a project ready. Luckily, I have one set up which you can use to follow along. Head over to the GitHub project link in the description below to clone the project to your computer. Clone the project using the git clone command. Once you've cloned the repository, go ahead and open it in PyCharm. So the first thing we want to do is create a virtual environment. So head over to your preferences, project, project interpreter, and create or select the virtual environment you would like to use. You will see we have an empty one over here in which we will be installing all the required packages that we will need in just 1 minute. The next thing we want to do is change the default test runner to PyTest. So head down to Tools, Python Integrated Tools, and change the default test runner to PyTest. Since we don't yet have PyTest installed, let's go ahead and install it. We can either go to the Preferences, back to our project, Project Interpreter, and install it from here, or you can create a requirements file, and start adding your requirements here. We will also be requiring PyTest Django, and we can probably go ahead and install Django itself. PyCharm is nice enough to pick up that we have a requirements.txt file and that the requirements are not yet satisfied. So let's just click here to install requirements. Once the requirements are installed, they will end up back in our project interpreter. In order to finish our setup for PyTest, we need to create another pytest.ini file. Create the file and add the following contents. These contents state that our default settings module is the mysite.settings file, and that any Python file starting with test or ending with test or is completely named tests will be run by default using PyTest. If you were wondering about the project that we will be using, it is the writing your first Django app from the Django documentation. You can find it on the documentation page for the Django project. Now that our setup for PyTest is complete, let's get started by writing our first test. Go to the polls application, to the tests file, and write the following test case. You will see the test that we are writing here tries to access the index page of our application. Since we have not yet created that page, we expect our first test to fail. However, as with pure test-driven design, this is a great start. In order to run your test case, you can right-click on the test method you would like to run, select the run method, and you should see your test output in the window below. Since we have not yet created our view, we expect our test to fail, and that is exactly what we see on our output. It'll tell us that we have no reverse match for the polls URL that we are trying to access. Let's go to our views.py file and add our view. We also need to route our URL to our newly created view. So create a new Python file, call it urls.py, and add the index path to this file. One last thing we need to do is add our new application URLs to our site URLs. You can do that by adding the path to the URL patterns. Always remember to include any unimported packages. We should now be able to go back to our test. You will see it in the run history at the top right, and rerun your test using the run icon. This time, our test runs successfully. Now let's dive into the functionality of our interactive debugger by adding a breakpoint to our index view. Let's go back to our tests, and now this time we run using the debug option of our test runner. When running your test in debug mode, your test will pause at the breakpoint that we have just created. With our test paused at the breakpoint, we are now able to inspect all the variables at this point. We can see that our request object and all its contents are shown below, and also the response text variable that is defined in this view. The great thing is you can see the value and the name of this expression. At this point, we also have a few neat functions we can do. We can resume our program, we can stop execution completely, or we can step over functions, we can step into functions, we can step into our own code, we can step out of functions, and run to the cursor. For demonstration purposes, let's step into the function that you see over here. Here we can see we've stepped into the HTTP response class. There's not much to see here, so we can resume our program execution. Since we have no other breakpoints, our test will exit. In order to provide a better understanding of how useful the debugger can be, let's jump ahead to part 5 of the Django application. You can find that by checking out the part 5.1 tag in the GitHub repository provided, or just follow along with the Django default application project in their tutorial. In the tutorial, there is a test which should test whether a post was published recently. Unfortunately, this test is failing, and we need to find out why. So let's go ahead and run the test and see what happens. Since a future dated post should not yet have been published, we assert that our question should not have been published yet. Let's try and find out what's going wrong here by going to our model and inspecting the publish date and adding a breakpoint. Let's go back to our test and run it in debug mode. Our test pauses in the was published recently method, which we can now use to inspect what is going wrong. We can see that our publication date is set to 30 days in advance. However, what we would love to do is check whether this statement evaluates to true or false. There is a function in the debugger that we can use to do that, and that is the evaluate expression utility. Let's add our code fragment and evaluate it. Here we see that this results in true, which is not what we want. If we think about it for a little bit, we should realize that we should also check that the publication date is greater than the current date and time. So let's add that piece of information to our code and update the expression, and we change the evaluation around to make it a little bit more clear to see what's going on. Let's run our test again in debug mode. We can now see the current date and time, and we can also evaluate our expression. We now see that it correctly evaluates to false, which is what we are testing for in our test. So let's continue our test, and we now see that it passes successfully. Even though we haven't gone into detail into all the utility functions that the PyCharm interactive debugger has to offer, they are incredibly helpful, especially the step over and step into my code functions. I use these every day. I highly recommend trying them out for yourself. For example, if we did not know where in code things are going wrong, we can use the step into function to find exactly which pieces of code gets evaluated and find the place where we need to fix our code. Let's run in debug again and step through our test case from the start. Let's use the step over function to reach our assert. Next, we can use the step into function evaluation to find our was published recently method. We can use the step over again, and if we want to jump to the end, we can use the resume. I hope this was helpful and helps you debug and fix problems in your code much faster. Have a nice day and see you in the next one.